You're done.
As Dr. Guy said, my name is Chandler Everhart, and for this project, my thesis advisors were Dr. Trenum and Dr. Wilkerson. A little bit of background about the testing site and why I chose to conduct this study. The Mossy Creek Wildlife Observation Area, known as the WOA, by most people in the biology department, is a 23-acre wetland just a mile away from campus. It's the habitat for 139 confirmed species of avian life, with 140th species discovered during the course of the study. And the study was loosely based on a general biology lab that students will conduct during their first semester here at Carson Newman. This is a satellite view of my testing site. This little blue dot right here is blind A, and it is where most of the data collection began. The yellow dot is where my downstream, aka wetland, water collection data was obtained, and the red dot is blind B, which overlooks a significant portion of the wetland. This study is about 3.5 years in the making. Back during fall of 2018, I took general biology, and the lab with that has students learning about the water system that we have around us. And when students conduct that study, it's largely showing that the creek has good data that would support life. But Dr. Wilkerson mentioned that there is another factor that impacts this, that being the zinc concentrations. So this is what kind of got those gears spinning in my mind. Fall of 2019, I had ecology with Dr. Trenum, and that introduced me to the wetland itself. And I saw the immense amount of birds that inhabited the area. Everything from the common red-winged blackbird all the way up to an osprey. And for my data collections, spring 2021 was when experimental data collections happened, and that'll be shown on the next slide. That was how I got my data collection sheet prepared, and it was my first data point. Summer 2021 is when the formal data collection occurred, specifically from May to late June, and a little bit of July. And fall 2021 was when water collection and analysis occurred. So, for this study, I chose 3 indicators of avian life and 3 indicators of the chemical being of the creek. For the avian indicators, I picked Canada goose, great blue heron, and great egret. The chemical indicators I picked were zinc, the hardness, and the pH of Mossy Creek. Hardness and pH being ones that are reported yearly through our local TVA. So, figure 1 is my sample data collection sheet. It has temperature in Fahrenheit, time of data collection, and lists whether or not my indicators were present during each data collection event. Note that I did not enumerate most of the common species. I only enumerated my indicators as they serve as the richness of the site's data, but the others are serving as a diversity study for biodiversity. My avian observation methodology involved the Merlin bird identification app by Cornell, which would, when I opened it, listen for bird calls and suggest birds that may match that call. My custom data collection sheet that I showed before, field notes which were taken on my phone to allow easy access between Merlin and my notes, a set of binoculars provided by my father, and 90 minutes per observation event. I arrived 95 minutes before sunset, that way I can make enough time to get to blind A while making observations, and then go to blind B 45 minutes into my data collection to switch over to that site. The chemical analysis, I used Waterworks Zinc Check, Hydrogen InstaCheck pH test paper, and Waterworks Total Hardness as calcium carbonate check to measure the hardness of the water. And table 1 shows my indicators. It shows both the high counts and the mean average. there were 31 data collection events that occurred over the course of this study, the majority of which falling between May and July. The interesting one here is the Canada goose, as they have a breeding population. When I started this study, I would only be able to observe a maximum of 17 individuals, but that population ballooned to 67 over the course of the study, and most of them were subadults, juveniles, and hatchlings. And the great egret and blue heron both saw juveniles at the site, but they were less prevalent. It's potentially that they were stalking the wetland. And this is figure 2. It's the number of species observed over each month of the study. I know I said that the main study was from May to July, but one data collection event did occur in September when I was observing geese flying over the wetland. So, February shows a little bit of bias here, as I had not started this collection before. I was a very novice birder at the time, so I was observing less species than I would have later in the study. But in May, we started in earnest, and we start to see a generalized trend from May to July of birds observed. This does coincide with me learning to bird better, and also just a trend of birds being more active as the study occurred. As the early data collections in May weren't at even. They were in the morning, 90 minutes before sunrise, but after a conversation with Dr. Trentham, the study flipped from morning collections to evening collections, as we would see diurnal birds returning to their nesting sites within the wetland and see the awakening of nocturnal birds. In July here is the interesting one that I mentioned earlier. July 13th, I observed a yellow-crowned night heron. The species has never been reported at this site before or since. And it makes up the 52nd species observed. Of the historically observed species, only 51 were observed. So, tables 2 and 3. I combine these together as they did not take up that much space on my slides, but it looks at the historic pH value of upstream Mossy Creek and the historic hardness value. These were both reported from the Water Quality Portal, which is a program conducted by the U.S. Geological Service, StoreNet, and a few other services. Then my current pH value that I observed upstream was slightly alkaline at 8, and the current pH of the wetland was 7, which that is likely due to me using colorimetric tests that I only got whole numbers. It is likely that if I had done this test with the pH probe, that I would have got more reliable scientific data. And the hardness, both the hardness upstream and downstream was a consistent 180 parts per million using those hardness test strips. The zinc levels of Mossy Creek, upstream I observed 1.5 parts per million of zinc in the sample, whereas the wetland registered near 0 with these data collection strips. This is, however, very unlikely, as there will be zinc within the sediment, otherwise the plants would not be able to grow there, and the species present would likely not exist, as zinc is an essential nutrient, even in small doses. Limitations of the study. My study, sadly, was limited by a few factors. The water collection data was narrow and used observational data from these test strips, which can introduce human bias. I had to look at the key and compare these samples to said key, and that introduces a little bit of bias. If I had used other methodologies from the lab, it would be likely that my data would be more sound. Additionally, if someone decided to repeat this study, other potential indicators could be chosen, and that can change the results provided here. So if someone picked American robin and wanted to enumerate on them, it's likely that with them being so prevalent in the area, that it would show much more richness of that species versus the great blue heron. And my conclusions that I was able to come up to. This was a modern analysis of Mossy Creek. Dr. Trenum and I were both excited to see how the creek was doing in modern day and see how the wetland was doing in addition. I was able to determine a relationship between the WOA populations of birds and the water analysis. As if you look upstream at the little testing site and wetland that is behind the football field, you're not going to find many bird species, especially not these large wading birds and waterfowl. And in addition to this, Dr. Trenum suggested that further studies could be possible for other students of the honors department with the data that we collect. I know I ran a little bit short there, but any questions?
So, why didn't you use a pH probe?
I had intended to, but I did not know how to calibrate it, and I made the mistake of trying to do this study largely on my own, which resulted in this error.
I had one you could have used.
I know.
That is possible.
And that's, I got it from the department. That's where all my data collection strips came from. In fact, I've been meaning to give those back to you.
Why did you choose the heron and the egret? Don't they occupy a similar niche?
They do occupy a similar niche of them being both wading birds, but their populations were prevalent enough that and they coexisted well enough within the wetland, that I believed that they would be good indicators of the species and the environmental health. As if they're occupying that same niche, they have to serve some different way of partitioning that resource. And if that wetland can provide that resource in such numbers that 9 total individuals were observed, that's a good indicator of the wetland health.
So you did the bird surveys over there, like behind the baseball field and at the WOA?
My bird surveys of the wetland area behind the football field were not really reported in this study, but I did them. I went over there. All I was really finding was robins and other common grassland birds.
How do you say that there's a correlation between the amount of zinc, since zinc was higher upstream and lower and downstream? How can you correlate that with avian biodiversity if you don't tally avian biodiversity both places?
Yes. Well, I looked at zinc toxicity for that, and that was the correlation I was trying to draw there, was that high zinc levels would indicate possible toxicity of that wetland and the stream that it's running behind the football field. Whereas if I was looking downstream and seeing lower zinc levels, it may indicate that the wetland is balancing it better and providing it better for those individuals that occupy it.
So are the plants in the wetland taking out the zinc?
Yes, that was what I was able to understand.
What's the LD50 for zinc for these birds?
LD50?
I mean, is it, you said it's high zinc levels, so what qualifies it as high?
High zinc levels would be 5 parts per million. That's the legal limit set by the EPA. And I was registering almost 2 parts per million.
Okay.
So it is high. It's not the maximum amount allowed by the EPA, but it's still significantly higher than I would have expected going into the study.
What's the source of the zinc?
The zinc is the zinc mine that's around the area. It was very important to early Mossy Creek, and it's kind of started leaching into the water supply.
Is that mine still active?
Not to my knowledge.
You should have gone upstream from the mine. That would have been, see what is it, you know?
My issue with that was that the spring is in that subdivision there, and I didn't want to possibly encroach on someone's land.
Permission.
Yeah. Hindsight is 20/20, and that does provide further ways that the study could be conducted.
It's a big difference between those two sites. Can you go back to figure 1 more?
Absolutely.
Up there at the top, 10,
It was in Fahrenheit.
okay, then what's the 30? That was the 10?
Yes, that was conducted on February 4th, 2021, and it was a bitterly cold morning out.
Oh, okay, but you were just there 20 minutes?
Yes, as I had class at 8 o'clock. So that was like just setting the baseline for the data.
Oh, that was just okay.
Like
Because
where,
you had said that you had 90 minutes. of
that was
observation.
when like we had started the process
So that
proper.
was just your example of the kind of sheet you would use?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, all right. Thank you.
And we need a species who arrived at Mossy Creek were migratory. I mean, could that account for your higher numbers as summer came on?
Potentially, but Dr. Trim and I had discussed that. And most of the species that we will observe migrating in occur later in the year. Like you'll see the duck populations boom in late November till early January.
Your warblers will come in though in April or May, and I've seen warblers down there before. But maybe not so many to affect your town.
So have you reported the species that you found that you weren't expecting?
The only one that I did not expect was the yellow-crowned night heron. And I meant to submit that to eBird,
Right.
and I still have that data collection on my phone for Merlin. I just have not yet submitted it.
Don't graduate without doing that.
Yes.
That's absolutely correct. Right, science knowledge is only good if it's put in the public domain, folks, so we got to put it.
Anybody else?
Did you see the beavers down there? Is the beaver lodge active?
The Beaver Lodge is active. I counted 6 individuals over the course of my study.
Yes, they come and go.
Yeah, they come up there.
I've seen everything from red-tailed hawk, white-tailed deer, beavers, and there was some unknown large mammal crashing through the underbrush one night. I would assume it was a white-tailed deer. Cannot prove or disprove that though. I just heard the sound and was like, okay, moving to blind B now. Charles.
So to get an idea of how it's changed over time, your historical data, when is that from?
The historical data ranges from 1950 all the way up to 2021 when this study was conducted. The majority of the data was collected by Dr. Howard Chitwood. They have his data on eBird, and I was very fortunate to be able to access that. All right, I think that's about it. Thank you all so much.